Hi, today we're going to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson. Give you a little bit of biographical information on Emerson. We are still in America, mid 19th century. Emerson lived for the majority of his life in Concord, Massachusetts, and he is part of what has become known as Transcendentalism. He did not invent the concept, if you will. Transcendentalism really begins in German philosophy and writing, but it's something that Emerson was interested in. He travels to Europe at one point in his life, and he meets folks like William Wordsworth, who we read earlier in the semester. And so really, I guess you could say, in some ways, Transcendentalism is an American form of Romanticism. Might be one way to look at it, because Transcendentalism, as it has become defined in the modern era, is a 19th century American literary movement that really is a reaction against scientific rationalism, which are some of the same things that we say about Romanticism. It relies heavily on intuition, an individual's intuition, and also that studying nature is the way to understand the world, that nature reveals spiritual truths. And we'll see a lot of that in the portions from nature that I had you read for today. It's interesting to note that Emerson was really well respected as a writer and a thinker and a lecturer during his lifetime. Some people argue that Emerson is kind of the first man of letters in America. And by that we mean he really derived all of his income, made his living only from speaking and writing engagements, which was a difficult thing to do in 19th century America, and a difficult thing to do today as well. Some other interesting things about Emerson that you want to keep in mind is that he was a mentor of sorts, a very good friend to Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden. Thoreau lived in Emerson's house from time to time for long periods of time. Thoreau was kind of a jack of all trades, and so Emerson had him do some practical building for himself and also do some gardening. So it's kind of an interesting friendship, if you will. And also, when Thoreau writes Walden, he's kind of vague about this piece of land near Walden Pond that he is building upon, but Emerson owned the land and let Thoreau use it. More interesting than that, as you're reading Emerson's nature, if you hear some echoes from Thoreau, it's for a pretty good reason, because Thoreau admired Emerson's writing and his thought. Thoreau's doing something a little bit different than Emerson, and as most mentor and mentee relationships go, Thoreau is trying to, when he's writing Walden, kind of break away from Emerson in some ways and kind of, take a lot of Emerson's ideas, but sort of begin to create his own unique philosophy. Some other works, if you're not familiar with Emerson, he was really well known for nature. The essay that you read for this section, another one of his really well-known essays is called Self-Reliance, and just what it sounds like. He talks about what it means to rely upon oneself, and really it has helped to create the mythos of Americans being self-made men and women. He also wrote The American Scholar, which I would encourage you, if you like nature at all, to make sure at some point, if you haven't already, read The American Scholar. It is a address that he delivered at Harvard, and he really lays the foundation for what he thinks it means to be a thinker, an educated person in America. And then one of my favorites that he also wrote is called Circles, and if you like nature, then you'll enjoy Circles. If you don't like nature, you probably won't like Circles, because he begins to talk about how things are interconnected and how thought works. But there's just some of his other well-known works. Something else I want you to keep in mind: if it took you a long time to read Nature, consider this. It was a written document. You can actually go to Concord, Massachusetts, and take a tour of the Old Mains, which is a house that Emerson's grandfather owned, and Emerson lived there for a period of time. And you can look out the window that Emerson looked out of while he was writing Nature. It's also interesting to note that Nathaniel Hawthorne, who would go on to write the Scarlet Letter, rented the old Mains from the Emerson family years after Emerson lived there, because specifically he wanted to sit at the desk and look out the window where Emerson had written nature. But Hawthorne loved nature so much that he kept getting distracted and wanted to go outside and take a walk. And it is still a beautiful area to go and visit. And then probably my favorite thing about that room in the old Mains is that when Hawthorne told Emerson, "Hey, I can't sit looking out the window," Emerson hired Thoreau to come and build a built-in writing desk that faced towards the wall, so Hawthorne wouldn't be distracted. And you can still go there today and see the built-in desk that Emerson asked Thoreau to build, and upon which Hawthorne wrote his first collection of short stories. But anyway, besides just some sort of interesting trivia, keep this in mind. Emerson was a lecturer, and people would have come and either paid or found some other way of entering into the lecture hall, and they would listen to Emerson deliver lectures this long. He delivered nature orally on more than one occasion, so if it took you a long time to read it, imagine sitting in an unair-conditioned hall in New England for several hours listening to Emerson deliver this. And it's widely popular. People love to go and hear him speak. Let's delve right into the text, though, and start looking at some of the things that he's trying to convey in this essay. And really, nature's one of the first pieces that really put Emerson on the map, and people began to kind of respect him as a man of ideas. It's on page 127. If you have the textbook, I'm going to actually use the secondary page numbers that are on the top of every page. So it starts on 820. Now, it's sometimes difficult to lose track of the fact that Emerson is talking about nature throughout this entire essay. It's called Nature, and he talks about it in the first section. But I want you to keep in mind that as you move on to different passages like language, he says that language is one of the uses of nature, and he talks about imagination and discipline. He's still talking about nature throughout. So what does he mean by nature? There on 820, he really kind of lays out, I'm just going to read starting with philosophically. Philosophically considered, the universe is composed of nature and the soul. Strictly speaking, therefore, all that is separate from us, all which is philosophy, distinguishes as the not me, that is, both nature and art. All other men and my own body must be ranked under the name nature. In enumerating the values of nature and casting upon their sum, I shall use the word in both senses. So really, some of the same ways that we still use nature today. A lot of times when we say nature, we think trees, birds, rural landscapes, rivers, and the like, the natural world. Emerson is also talking in the sense of when we say human nature, right? What makes us human, those sorts of things. One of the challenging things about reading Emerson is that he often uses nature to mean the natural world, and sometimes he uses it to mean human nature, and sometimes he kind of blends the two together, and it's not always easy to distinguish when he's moving from one to the other. But if you keep that in your mind, that he's meaning nature in every sense of the word, I think it's helpful as we read. Chapter 1 that starts on 821, the section that is called Just Nature. He starts off, I think, in a nice place that all of us can relate to in some ways. I'm really talking about the beauty of the natural world. Sorry, I need a drink here. All right, on 821. And he starts off by talking about how powerful it is to go outside and look at the stars, right? And if you have been in a place that is not affected with light pollution, i.e. you can get out of the city limits on a really clear, dark night, it's rather stunning what the sky looks like. The interesting thing is that then as he moves through that first section, he hits on things that I think lots of us think are incredibly beautiful. We've been moved in some way by being in the natural world. But he asks, is that enough, right? Is it really real? What can you do with that type of nature? And I want to look, well, actually, before I go completely to that part, let's look on the top of 8:22. Yeah. Here are some of the most famous passages from this essay. About 2 lines in on the top of 8:22. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The concurrence of the universal beings circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. What a powerful statement of how nature impacts him. How much has been written about this idea of the transparent eyeball, and sadly we don't have time to go too far into that. But I do just want to mention briefly that one of the concepts that Emerson has in terms of living in the natural world is that if he is a transparent eyeball, then it's not a clear separation between him and the natural world, right? That the natural world, in a way, is passing through him. And he's being able to see, he's able to sense everything. And he's talking in visually, but really that image brings in, I think, all of the senses. And then ultimately what he gets to then is later in the piece, he begins to talk rather philosophically. We might touch back on it when we get there. But how useful is the natural world? Can we trust what we see, what we feel, what we sense? And he goes a little bit deeper into that. Before he gets there, though, chapter 2 on 8:22 talks about commodity. And commodity just in the way that we think about commodity in the modern sense of the word, something that is bought and sold. And so he's moving through. He's saying, well, in one case, human beings love the beauty of nature, and then in another sense, nature is something that is bought and sold, right? And I think the most clear example of this is when he talks about the difference of the woodcutter, what the tree is to the woodcutter, as opposed to what the tree is to the poet or the artist. And so here's the one thing that I want you to think about. Does Emerson think that viewing nature as a commodity is something that is bad? At this point in living with the Romantic writers, most of us would probably say, yeah, I guess he probably does, but not quite. Emerson really makes it pretty clear in this essay that nature was created for humans, right? That it is something that we should use. And so in some ways that seems like a pretty traditional Christian view, a very conservative view. But I think Emerson would say a little bit more about that. I think certainly he doesn't have any problem with nature being used to produce things. Emerson lived in a really nice house. His first wife tragically passed away when Emerson was very young, and that's where he got some of his wealth. So he is not opposed to consuming things. But I think he would argue moderation in all things. That yes, we use the natural world so that we can live and function and enjoy life. But when he thinks about using nature, it's more to make us more alive and more awake, which is an idea that Thoreau is going to take and run with in Walden. If you look at the bottom of the last section in Commodity on 8:23, he says, a man is fed not that he may be fed, but that he may work. So for Emerson, the number one reason to consume, to eat, is so that humans have energy to work. Now, based on everything that we might know about Emerson, a man who made his living speaking and writing, You might think, does he really mean that? But obviously, he's not talking about for himself manual labor. He didn't really have any interest in working in a factory or being a farmer. But for him, intellectual work is just as important as any other type of work. Now, I might be a little bit biased because I get paid to write and read and think, but I think he makes a good point. But I think it's important to realize at that point when he says we must be fed so that we can work, that he thinks intellectual work is as valuable as any other kind. Chapter 3 is where he really picks up, I think, what he introduces in section 1, which is called nature. Chapter 3 is beauty, and he really breaks it down. Sometimes folks get frustrated with Emerson because it seems to be that he's random and he's all over the place, and sometimes he kind of is. He's like many of the other works that we've looked at this semester. You can just kind of dive in anywhere, any given paragraph, maybe a line, and ponder it for a while. But I do want to make it clear that Emerson's always got a structure in mind. And if you look at section 3 with beauty, he really has 3 major points that he wants to make with beauty. And he does give us numbers on 824, 825, and then at 826. And what he starts with on 824 are the 3 aspects of beauty. And he says right there at the top of 824, first, the simple perception of natural forms is delight, right? And he really waxes poetic throughout these first column and a half about how wonderful just enjoying the beauty of nature is. On the top of 825 then is where he gets into this idea that I talked about just a minute ago. I'm going to read this paragraph here on 825. But this beauty of nature, which is seen and felt as beauty, is the least part. The shows of the day, the dewy morning, the rainbows, mountains, orchards and blossom, stars, moonlight, shadows and still water and the like, if too eagerly hunted, become shows merely and mock us with their unreality. Go out of the house to see the moon, and it is mere tinsel. It will not please as when light shines upon your necessary journey. The beauty that shimmers in the yellow afternoons of October, who could ever clutch it? Go forth to find it, and it's gone. So I think what Emerson's getting at here is, as overwhelmed as we are by beauty and as enriched by the beauty of nature as we are, that it's kind of difficult to grasp it, right? That there always seems to be a distance between us and the beautiful sunset. We sit by a river that is beautiful and peaceful, but interacting with it is a difficult thing. And I would argue that then for the rest of this essay, Emerson begins to make the argument of how we can become more aware and interact with nature so that we begin to break that barrier down. And one of the big things is to acknowledge or realize that human beings are indeed a part of nature, right? This ties in perfectly with what a lot of the other writers we've been looking at in terms of being uneasy with advancing technologies, and Emerson is a little less concrete than some other folks we've read, but certainly he is making the argument that humans have kind of lost sight of the fact that we are part of the natural world. I'm going to move on to another section here. Let's look on 826. Still talking about beauty. But I want to make sure you didn't miss this. On 826, there's a numeral 3 there. It's his third point that he's making. And he talks about there is still another aspect under which the beauty of the world may be viewed, namely as it becomes an object of the intellect. And so think about what he's talking about there, that beauty is the art of the intellect. In some ways, we may associate everything that Emerson's been talking about, writing about, with an emotional response. And certainly emotional responses is something that is dear to him. But what Emerson adds that I'm not so sure that folks like Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley emphasize too much, is that Emerson is like, yeah, this is something that you can understand intellectually, right? If you're trying to be too rational, excuse me, you might miss certain things and experiences, but it is something that we use our brains and our thought to comprehend. He has some nice statements about what he thinks art is. There in the middle of 826, the production of a work of art throws a light upon the mystery of humanity. A work of art is an abstract or epitome of the world. It is the result or expression of nature in miniature. And I love that idea. Like any type of art, visual art, sculptures, music, writing, all true art is a miniature of nature. It is a representation of nature. And he ends that paragraph with, "Thus in art does nature work through the will of a man filled with the beauty of her first works." If we look on 827, he gives us some more kind of structure, if you will. Lets us know that he says that he's going to talk about how art and beauty function in language. This is my favorite part of this essay. I think it's really intriguing. It may give us some more concrete things to latch onto than some other things. But in essence, he talks about how language is not just words. It's not just functional. But all language, all words have a referent, right? They have an original in a natural thing or a natural idea. For instance, in number 2 on 827, he says, "But this origin of all words that convey a spiritual import, so conspicuous a fact in the history of language, is our least debt to nature. It is not words only that are emblematic, it is things which are emblematic. Every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact." And then he goes on and he says, a lamb is innocence, a snake is subtle spite, flowers express to us delicate affections. And then he gives a couple more examples. And in the beginning of the next paragraph, "Who looks upon a river in a meditative hour and is not reminded of the flux of all things?" So it's kind of a complex idea, maybe to really figure out, but it's rather simple in some other ways. Again, that words aren't just words. They actually mean something. They refer us back to a truth in the spiritual and or natural world. So I think it's a really intriguing thing to ponder. On page 828, about the only thing that I want to point out, you may have noticed, like where it begins, because of this radical correspondence, he's arguing for simplicity. He uses the unfortunate word savages. He is specifically referring to Native Americans, but in what he imagines to be a positive way, right? And he perceives the Native Americans that he's encountered or read about, is that maybe they understand that language and the natural world and the spiritual world are much better understood by Native Americans, because in his mind they've simplified how they express themselves, how they interact with nature, their religious beliefs. And then on the next full paragraph he says, "Thus is nature an interpreter, by whose means man converses with his fellow men. A man's power to connect his thought with its proper symbol and so utter it depends on the simplicity of his character, that is, upon his love of truth and his desire to communicate it without loss." I might argue in his emphasis on simplicity, there is some irony here, because he's saying, hey, the people who understand what I'm talking about the most are those who keep things simple, don't clutter up their minds and their explanations. Whereas for most readers, myself included, Emerson can be a tough read, and I think we might argue that his expression of thought is anything but simple. But it's worth the time trying to figure out what he's talking about. But I think there's a little bit of irony there. Let's move on to the top of page 830 as he's wrapping up his discussion of language. On the top of 830 he says, "This relation between the mind and matter is not fancied by some poet, but stands in the will of God so as to be free to be known by all men. I think the argument that he's making here is, hey, if you're reading what I'm writing and you think, well, Emerson's a man of literature, maybe even poetic, and this is just kind of a fancy way of looking at the world, his argument here is that it's not just poets who understand this connection between the spiritual and the physical world. He argues it's a matter of fact, right? And that it's the will of God that we experience nature in this way. I'm not going to say you have to agree with Emerson, but I think it's a nice rhetorical move that he makes there. That, hey, this isn't just some pie-in-the-sky idea. This is reality, and it's a reality that humans have lost track of. Kind of interesting what he does in chapter 5. And this may be where some readers begin to forget that he's still talking about nature, but this is called discipline. And when he's talking about discipline, he really means, in some ways, in the academic sense, all of us are or becoming an expert in a certain discipline, right? Business, science, art, literature, whatever it might be. And then we think about people and their occupations. We have different disciplines. But then again, part of having a discipline plays into the other meaning of that word, that we have to be disciplined, right, in order to do something well. And again, in this section, one of the main things he's arguing is that really nature is something to be studied. The philosophy that i.e. Emerson, is laying out here is like a discipline like any other. Let me make sure you got that. Let's see. There are highlighting that idea on 833. I just want to read this paragraph where he says, Herein is especially apprehended the unity of nature, the unity of variety, which meets us everywhere. All the endless variety of things make a unique and identical impression. And then he skips down towards the end. Every particular in nature, a leaf, a drop, a crystal, a moment in time, is related to the whole and partakes of the perfection of the whole. Each particle is a microcosm, and a faithful renders the likeness of the world. And so he takes us down on the microscopic level, or looking at an individual drop of water on an individual leaf on a tree, right? And so again, he's arguing that in some cases to study nature like a discipline can open up our channels of thought. Let's move on to the sixth section on page 834, where he begins to talk about idealism. And again, a lot of times Emerson's arguments introduce something new and at the same time loop back onto an idea that he's already introduced and explains it further. Here he really taps into a very old argument that philosophers have, from Plato onward, have been contemplating. And basically the idea, does the real physical world exist? Or is everything we see a shadow of something else, an illusion of sorts? I wish that this was a live classroom setting right now, because I would love to have an immediate answer from everyone on how Emerson answers that question. Because I might argue that he answers yes. Reality is real. The physical world is real. You can experience it with all your senses. And yes, it is an illusion. And so it's an interesting part. Just look at some of the sections. Early on the top of 835, he seems to be arguing, yes, every reality is real. The frivolous make themselves merry with the ideal theory, as if its consequences were burlesque, as if it affected the stability of nature. It surely does not. God never jests with us, right? He says, why would God put us in a natural world that's just a shadow or an illusion of something else? But then he asks further down in the paragraph, to the senses. To the senses and the unrenewed understanding belongs a sort of instinctive belief in the absolute existence of nature. And he ends that paragraph, the best, the happiest moments of life are those delicious awakenings of the highest power and the reverential withdrawing of nature before God. Make sure, in this section and a little bit further on, I think this is what ultimately Emerson's arguing, that if we're not aware, if we're not awake, if we're not paying attention to what's going on, then yes, much of what we're encountering is an illusion or a shadow of something else. However, to the person who is aware and alive and contemplating nature and beauty, both with their intellect and their soul and with their spirit, then they will be able to actually see what is at hand. He talks early in this essay about how people are unable to see the sun, right? And it's not because it's too bright that they can't see it. It's because they don't know exactly what they're looking for, right? That oftentimes we miss the most common, obvious things in our life because we're not looking. So it's a different type of blindness. He praises the poet on page 836. Section 2 there. In a high manner the poet communicates the same pleasure. By a few strokes he delineates on air the sun, the mountains, the camp, the city, the hero, the maiden, not different from what we know them, but only lifted from the ground and float before the eye. And so for Emerson, poets, and by poets he means writers, he talks about Shakespeare, who wrote poetry and prose. He refers to himself as a poet, and he did write some poetry, but he's best known for his prose. But he champions the poet, the writer, the artist as those who can help us see much of what we're missing through their artistic creations. Move on. On the bottom of 838, number 5, where he begins to talk about ethics and religion. Here's something you don't want to miss. Emerson is the grandson and the son of a Unitarian minister. Emerson went to Harvard to become a Unitarian minister, and he was a Unitarian minister for several years early in his life. But Emerson has a problem with organized religion and traditional Christianity throughout his entire life. And one of his main arguments we begin to see here in nature is that as well-meaning as organized religion might be, he would argue that it sends people to focus in the wrong direction for this main point that he makes in nature. He says that religion says, and he's thinking traditional Christianity, that there's nothing of value in this world, right? That what really matters is the next life. And for Emerson, that's problematic because he loved this world so much. He feels like that there's so much energy and truth and beauty and inspiration in this world. Why would we slog through this world just waiting for an afterlife? So Emerson, definitely not a traditional Christian, but absolutely spent his entire life thinking about the nature of God and the power of spirituality. So I just want to make that clear, that if it seems like in section 5 that he is a bit negative about religion and man-made standards of ethics, that's because he is. You don't have to agree with him, but that's where he's going. Let's look at chapter 7, Spirit, that starts on the bottom of 839. Because here's where he, after he kind of dismisses organized religion, he wants to make it clear that he doesn't dismiss notions of God, even of Christ. If you look on the top of 840, he says, the aspect of nature is devout. Like the figure of Jesus, she stands with bended head and hands folded upon the breast. The happiest man is he who learns from the nature the lesson of worship. So he's very much into the idea of worship, very much into the idea of prayer, but he means some things just slightly different than what folks who are traditional Christians might mean. Talks a lot about in this section what he feels like the Spirit is. I think some of the most powerful parts of this section are on 841. Let's start with the second line on the top of 841. This view, which admonishes me where the sources of wisdom and power lie and points to virtue, as to, quote, the golden key which opes the palace of eternity, carries upon it the face the highest certificate of truth, because it animates me to create my own world through the purification of my soul. The world proceeds from the same spirit as the body of the man. Here he's making two arguments, that really the most enlightened human beings are ones who create their own reality, which I realize there's some danger there, but it is an idea that Emerson throws out. Create your own way of seeing the world. But then he also makes that argument, stop separating the body from the spirit. Stop separating humans from the world, right? It's all interconnected. We can see echoes of lots of the folks that we've read this semester. And then a nice line there in his final paragraph on this section. He says, is not the landscape every glimpse of which hath a grandeur, a face of him? And by him, of course, he means God, or Emerson's concept of God, the creator, right? So he makes an argument that we've seen throughout the semester, that if you want to discover and know God, spend time in the natural world. Again, I realize some people might be uncomfortable with pantheism, nature worship, and the like, but it is certainly something that, that Emerson valued. I think it's important to point out, I mentioned earlier what a big impact that Emerson had on Thoreau, but when you begin to read passages like this, I hope that it reminds you a little bit of Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman lived in New York, so geographically he is not in the same neighborhood as Emerson. Whitman was significantly younger than Emerson, but Whitman absolutely adored Emerson's writings, and he sent his first copy of Leaves of Grass to Emerson. Emerson wrote him a really nice note that included the line, I greet you at the beginning of a fantastic or a great career. And Whitman, without asking permission, printed that quote from Emerson on the spine of his first copy of Leaves of Grass, which apparently Emerson wasn't too happy about, but he had to be delighted by the poetic vision that Whitman continued to express in his own writing, doing his own thing, but championing some of the same ideas that Emerson had. Kind of wrap up here then, the last chapter in nature is prospects, and just a couple of things that I want to point out. I just think it's curious. On page 843, Emerson begins to wrap up his argument, and he basically says, hey, I'm just going to give you a couple more words of wisdom, which hopefully they reminded you of Blake's Proverbs of Hell, because there's kind of nice one-liners here. But on 843 he says, I shall therefore conclude this essay with some traditions of man and nature, which a certain poet sang to me. And if you read your footnote in the version you're reading, that certain poet is Emerson. He certainly was a man with a tremendous ego, and I think for what he was trying to accomplish in terms of his writing, it takes a pretty big ego to tackle the topics that he's tackling. I think it's kind of funny. In conclusion then, let's look on 844. And he talks about, on the first full paragraph on 844, the problem of restoring to the world original and eternal beauty is solved by the redemption of the soul. He's mentioned that a couple of times. For him, much of the world and much of the way that humans think about the world is broken, and his argument that is, in order to bring restoration and peace to the earth, is to restore one's own soul, to get back in touch with the natural world, to change our way of thinking. And so regardless of what you think of his religious beliefs, I think he has some pretty helpful ideas that still resonate today. And then finally, on the bottom of page 844 there, last full paragraph, it will not need when the mind is prepared for study to search for objects. The invariable mark of wisdom is to see the miraculous in the common. So he says the most wise thing human beings can do is to spend time in the common, the everyday, the natural world, right? And that's where we receive inspiration and revelation, what he calls the miraculous. And then in a beautiful paragraph on the very end on 845, he gives us some great one-liners that I'd like to leave you with. Know then that the world exists for you. And then a couple lines later, build, therefore, your own world.